Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
I'm Elizabeth Stevens from the School of Communication and Arts at the University of Queensland.
Prof. Stevens, thank you very much for being with us today. We have a very frisky, feisty podcat here in Chinguri, and we've just established that you have some red in your hair. He has a poor history of responding to the presence of red-headed women on Zoom, in that he can be very difficult. So we're going to see what the reaction is today. Anyhow, much more importantly than that, thank you very much for being with us. And my first question is my standard one, which is to ask what's currently dynamizing, interesting, impeding, preoccupying you? What's going on for the prof?
Yeah, that's a good and it's a big question to ask, because I'm happy to say there's a lot to be excited about at the moment. I'm not going to look at the impeding part. There's a lot that people talk about in terms of that at the moment. A lot of things to be depressed and feel impeded about. But in fact, there's a lot that's really exciting that's going on that has been stimulating my own thinking and work at the moment. I'm really impressed by the work of my Indigenous colleagues in Australia at the moment who are doing amazing things, and early career researchers in my area as well. But most immediately, I would say the thing that is sort of dynamizing my research is that I'm on long service leave this semester, which means that I get to do that part of our jobs that we love so much, which is to have the time to actually do research slowly without feeling like there is a clock that's ticking and spinning around too fast in front of you each day, and you frantically try and make some inroads into the work that you want to do, but the time is going around too fast to possibly catch up and the email is filling up all the time. I am blissfully free, as we ever are, of email at the moment, and having some time to do some really deep research at the moment, which for those of us who work in Australia, if you do archival research, as I do, has been a really interrupted period of time because, of course, the borders of this country were closed for 2.5 years, opened a couple of years ago. But for those of us who are in teaching and research positions, it's the narrow window in which you're able to go away during teaching semesters. So I'm having some wonderful catch-up time here, having done some archival research, doing a bunch more on my long service leave, and really delving into the pleasures of research.
That's lovely. And tell us more about archival research. What is it and what kind are you purveying?
Yeah, a lot of what I'm looking at the moment are some of the histories in scientific archives. And I'm smiling when we're talking, Toby, because of course I've got the beautiful image of your cat coming in and out of the screen as we're talking, doing a little scientific test, for us, whether to decide whether or not definitively, empirically, I am a red-headed person. The cat's been quite frisky, so I'm feeling like the initial evidence might be on there's noticeable redheadism going on. These, funnily enough, are the kinds of things that I've been looking at in archives as well, that I've been looking at some archives that might not have the status of what we think of as scientific archives, for one thing. So some of the archives I'm looking at, and this is one of the reasons I'm sort of jazzed, to talk about this, are in different kinds of places. So one of the archives that I've been looking at that I'm going back to in just a couple of weeks in France is an archive of physical objects. It's an archive of fairground arts and technologies that is a private archive and private museum. You might have heard of it, Toby. It's the Musée des Arts Forains. It's in an industrial area of Paris called Bercy that used to be like a Docklands area, on the Seine there in Paris, quite a big area because it was industrial. And the French government have now given it to the private owner of this museum, who has collected 18th and 19th century fairground devices and like the big objects as well. Because usually all that's left from that period of time are quite small visual pieces. Maybe like people heard of the old panorama reels, for instance, and every now and again in the USA, one of them turns up rolled up in a corner somewhere, and it's a famous 19th century panorama with the Civil War on, a kilometre of painted scrolls or whatever that used to be shown in these sort of sites of popular entertainment in the 19th century. But the big objects, the rides, for instance, like the first carousels, some of the big mechanical objects, most of those effectively got hatcheted up and thrown into the 18th century equivalent of a skip. But one of the places that I've been going to is this museum that has a lot of original devices in them. So it has a museum, but it has an archive as well, much, of course, bigger than you can ever display in the museum. And the history of science and technology in these popular spaces is super interesting, because we don't tend to think of these as archives of science and technology. They tend to be like libraries and, sort of formal university archives of papers and so on. But the stories of these particular pieces are fascinating. Some of them, for instance, are early automated music boxes, like hurdy-gurdy machines that were devised for soldiers coming back from war who had lost their profession as being soldiers, but who often had terrible injuries as part of those wars as well. And so part of the reason for having these automated machines was to provide some employment stream for men who had come home that might have limited use of their limbs, for instance, and so on. And to be able to use these technologies, they had to change the laws of what could be like sound, what could be displayed on streets, what kind of people could be on streets, what could happen on streets. So you have these histories of these technologies, but also the cultures that go with them, the laws that go with them as well. And it's extremely rare to get the stories of those. It's the kind of thing that you actually have to turn up and go into the archive. There's no digitized version of doing this. There's no digital version of this archive. They're actual machines that you have to experience to get to the sense of what they were used for in the 19th century. So that's an example of one of the archives that I've been looking at.
Wow. And the dude who collected all this stuff, I mean, where did he keep it? In his bathtubs? And
so, well, of course, it grew over time. And then, this is one of the things that the French are good for, that having seen this amazing private museum develop, the French government said, have use of this space in Bercy, which is very big, where you can keep everything in one place, because we recognize that this is part of our cultural heritage, that we have these machines. One of the machines in there uses the old diorama technologies that have been largely lost from the 19th century. And it's the version where you would have a painted screen, and it would be painted in two ways, and if you shone a light on it from behind, you would see one scene, and if you shone a light on it from in front, you would see a different scene. So you could do things like show a volcano erupting, for instance. These kinds of visual technologies, like the skills behind them, have often been lost. So there's a whole trade, to make sure there are people who know what the technologies are for, to know how to use them. And they're quite big for people to use as well. One of the pieces in there is the a velo manège, which is what you call it, a carousel, a bicycle carousel from the 18th century. So it has like penny farthing, bicycles on it, and it's operated by everyone pedaling it. When you're on it, that's how it works. So the idea of this is to give poor people who would go to fun fairs, who are not rich people who could afford to buy penny farthings, the experience of having that, having access to that kind of technology, having the experience of speed that you wouldn't get in any other context. And so the archive has grown because people recognize how valuable this is, how much of a part of the cultural history of France these kinds of technologies are. And so the museum has been, and the archive has been enabled by buy-in from the French government as well.
And is this a do not touch museum, or will you be riding penny farthings furiously?
Oh, it's a very much please touch museum. So if you, and some of the rides are quite dangerous, like that bicycle one. If your feet come off it, the pedals are just not like a bicycle pedal that we have today with the little rubber bits on it, which are designed, as it turns out, so that you don't like shin yourself and break your shin on a metal bar if your foot comes off the bicycle. Whereas the original bicycles, if your foot comes off while you're pedaling it, it's very hard to get it back on again because it's just an actual a bar on it. So the rides are there to be used, and they're incredibly dangerous for young children who are one of the main audiences of the museum.
So will you be offering photographs in your next book of yourself surrounded by 6-year-olds on these machines?
Pushing them out the way so that I can have first go. I do have evidence that I have used these. I went on one, it's just closed actually, very sadly. I think it maybe was a little bit of a victim of the pandemic and the inability to have sideshows traveling around for a long period of time, because there was a fantastic, it's an old show family from the 19th century called Carter's Steam Fair, and Carters are a family group, and they go around the UK with their old-timey fair and rides. And I saw them by accident one time when I was there doing research in the UK on this topic, but not even knowing that Carter's Steam Fair existed. And I was with my partner, who was like, you got to go on those rides, don't you? And it was like, how intense can a 19th century ride be? So I have photos of myself on something called the steam boats, and they are indeed operated by steam, but they pretty much do a full kind of loop, and you and your companion are on either side, and so each time you go up you can see the other person and the effect of gravity on their body. It's kind of terrifying. I do have photographic evidence that I did these things to myself.
In terms of the purpose behind this really interesting research, is there a set of arguments or problems or issues that you're wanting to engage?
Yeah, there is. And it comes down to looking at, I guess, at unofficial archives, and archives that we might think of as sort of more non-serious scientific archives, because these archives are very experiential. And one of the stories about a scientific archive is that they're generally in the modern period, and therefore would have the word scientific attached to them, experimental archives, that they're archives based on observation, empirical observation, drawing, interpretations from those. And from that, the emphasis is always on the development of various kinds of knowledge or technologies as a kind of theoretical process, a process of ideas, theories of how things operate. The stories that we tell in histories of science, medicine, and technology are still very much progress-based narrative about successful technologies or ideas or processes and how they developed over time. But in fact, the history of experimentation is much more diverse than that. It is not just a history of experiments that take place in kind of proper scientific context, and they don't only work in that kind of, on that level of theoretical or intellectual work. So a lot of the archives that I look at are experiential archives that are kind of like laboratories for new physical sensations or the productions of new affect, for instance, which is not a part, it's not something that we talk about as a driver of technological innovation in the history of science. That tends to be a much more heady, cerebral story of ideas that are developed across time. But in fact, we can put back into these histories because they were there happening alongside them. We just haven't historicized those in the same way. A history that's about hands-on practitioners, about people who are inventing rides for people in sideshows that might actually be doing, having breakthroughs in terms of the visual technologies that are available at the time, and go on to have all kinds of other histories that have been very well recorded. But there are these other kinds of experiential, affective archives that are part of the history of science, medicine, and technology that are much less historicized. I mean, the histories that have been told about those.
And this draws me into asking about one of your earlier projects, book you wrote with Peter Kreil about the history of ideas of the normal. And you've also published about this in your own. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, because there you're looking at Europe in particular, but other places too, and where ideas of normality or normalcy emerge and what the work is that they do. And you used
that was yes, that was a wonderful book that I wrote with my dear colleague Peter Kreil over an extended period of time. It was such a fantastic experience to have putting that book together. It's a long book. It's almost 200,000 words long because it's a complex intellectual history of normality. But it was a book that we wrote together over a 7 or 8 year period, having lunch together once a week and discussing our work as we were writing it. And that really enriched the process, because in writing the book, Peter was really responsible for working on the 19th century and I worked on the 20th century, the history of normality. But of course, we were reading each other's work as we were researching it and writing across each other's work as we were doing that. So what I really brought to it was an interest in the popular history of the idea of normality and the moment where normality enters popular culture as a word that people use in everyday life, which happens surprisingly recently. And Peter was looking at this very complex 19th century where it's much more of a kind of word people use in scientific and medical jargon. It's not used very much in everyday life at all. And it was in putting those two things together. What we were interested in when we started, what we were sort of looking at, is that you get these, and this is part of where I come from, as a sort of cultural studies person looking at a very intellectual history topic, that you get these words like normality that are used so ubiquitously in so many different contexts that people take it for granted, and it's actually very hard to say what that word means. Like if you ask someone, what do you think the word, what does it mean to you when you say the word normal? And you think about how many times that's a word that we use, in everyday speech. We use it in so many different ways. People have been using it a lot recently to talk about political situations or, situations of medical pandemics or so on. Like, this is not climate change. This is not normal. You hear people talk about normality as a fraught state in the contemporary world all of the time. And yet if you said to someone, what does this word actually mean to you? People are, I don't know, it's too big to be nutted down. So we were really interested in, as a kind of cultural studies move, was to take a word that's ubiquitous and yet so vague that it's hard to define, and try and nut down what does this actual word actually mean. And we did it in a very Foucauldian genealogical way by tracing the incidence of the word normality itself. Where does it appear? How is it used? How does that change over time? And the big narrative that comes out of that across that long history from quite late in the 18th century into the present day is that the idea normal emerges, first of all, I will start with in the history of medicine, when people use phrases like normal and pathological anatomy, where it becomes a way to talk about a overall functional state of health. The biological mechanism is working in a usual kind of way. It's functional. That's what the word normal means when it's first used. And it's quite a dynamic term in that concept. Normal anatomy doesn't mean everything is perfectly regular in some kind of itemized way. It just means overall everything is working as you would expect it to work. So it's a very sort of dynamic kind of term. But basically it means healthy. In that context, you could take healthy as a synonym for normal when it first emerges. But then there's this moment at the end of the 19th century where the statisticians invent the idea of normal distribution as that kind of bell curve that people might be familiar with. And anything that happens kind of in the middle of the curve, that's the normal distribution. And then you have the distribution that's further out and more marginal at the other end of that. That's a more sort of static understanding of normal as a kind of statistical average in which you can give a number to it. Healthy is something much more dynamic and relational, but the idea of normal that appears in statistics at the end of the 19th century is a statistical average term. It's much more quantitative and less qualitative. What we noticed that was really fascinating is that there is a moment in the immediate post-Second World War period in which those two ideas weave that really in a way that, as someone, who delves in cultural history, it's like, this is too neat a cultural moment, to show this change that happens, where at the end of the Second World War, the first Museum of Health opens in the USA, and they launch with great fanfare the opening of the museum with two statues that are designed to represent the healthy, average, young American man and woman. They model the statues using the statistical averages of two giant anthropometric data sets, a data set of men who were soldiers going into and out of the First World War, and a large collection of biometrics of women to invent the first system of standardized clothing in women. So these enormous data sets. And then they produce statistically averaged models of them, and they say this is the very image of the healthy young American man and woman, and they call them Norma and Norman. And they have a USA-wide competition to find the living embodiment of the Norma statue, not Norman for some reason. I'll leave our listeners to speculate on why that might not be so much of an interesting question to find the normal man at that time. But there is this huge competition to find the normal woman. Someone wins the competition at the end of this time, and it's the person whose own body measurements are the closest to that of the statue. But at the end, they say, in fact, no one is identical to the statue, that the ideal statistically average person is both the mean of all the women who were mentioned, but she's also a hypothetical and ideal individual. So it's this dynamic where suddenly the normal becomes the name for something that doesn't actually exist in reality, but that everyone is told and didactically instructed to think of themselves in relation to, and indeed measure themselves physically and spiritually, people told as well, to think how they could make themselves more normal, although this is not a thing to do. This sets up a kind of dynamic, that's that dynamic of normalization that, of course, Foucault talks about so famously, where the idea of the normal then isn't a standard that people are measured by. You have a measurement of 9, you're normal or not normal. It becomes a system of measurement. with which everyone can be placed, and there can be infinite variations between. So you have a sense of the group normality and the population normality, but also your own individual position in relation to that. And because you can never achieve normality, you can only be oriented towards it. It's a very effective dynamic. So that's what we looked at in that book, the emergence of normality as something that's a dynamic that can take on different inflections in different contexts, because it's in fact an imbrication of two completely different concepts, one of which is qualitative and one of which is quantitative, and it can just slip from one to the other according to its utility in particular contexts.
And I guess this also applies to the proliferation of the normal school, a really big deal in the United States, although I guess emerging from France, right? And the idea of inculcating normalcy into students so it becomes a pedagogic routine really all over the world, right?
And absolutely right. And it reminds us that normal in that situation means standardization as well. So, normal schools are normal because they're using a standardized syllabus as well. So then there's that idea of normal as something that's a standard, that's something that can be applied to people and can be standardized as well.
What about eugenics and some of the policy implications of these developments? You write about that in the book.
Yeah, funny you should ask that. So the person who invents the idea of normal distribution in statistics is also the person who invents the term eugenics. That's Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. So the idea of those two things are very closely bound together, and the kinds of assumptions that creep into the idea of the normal around that time have some very eugenicist leanings to them. It's quite tempting, I think, to assume that the idea of the normal that is espoused in the work of Francis Galton as a famous eugenicist is itself quite of a rigid template. And I'm wondering if you're being attacked by your cat as we're talking, Toby. Because I think that might establish that the definitive scientific proof of my red hair.
You're a redhead. It's all over Barbara shouting, the scratching and the biting.
So there we are. Okay, it's a proven fact. So Francis Galton is one of the people who invent the idea of eugenics. But when he's doing this, what he says is that things need to be normal according to their own kind. So the idea of typing is very important in this kind of in early eugenics as well. We tend to think of eugenics being in its negative form straight away, but the earlier concepts of the intersection between eugenics and normality is that everything should be normal according to its own kind. But then, of course, you immediately have this idea that some kinds are better than other kinds as well. But one of the aspects of that I think that we've lost is that the eugenicists were concerned about both sides, the things that are on both sides of normal distribution. So we tend to think of the things that, eugenicists were concerned about in terms of people they would call abnormals. People had lower than average intelligence or lower than average physical capabilities and so on. But they were also super concerned with what was happening at the too high end as well. So the idea of people being too smart or too hyper-focused on particular things, the eugenicists were concerned about that as well. There's an idea of the kind of well-rounded individual that appears in eugenics that informs the kind of eugenics. I think the more dangerous intersection between ideas of eugenics and normality are the ones that look more benign, because we recognize the ones that look more, that have a history that we know about in Germany, in the 1930s and so on. But part of what gets woven into the history of eugenics with the statute that I mentioned and the find the embodiment of norma competition is this idea that you can always, even though none of us are ever going to be, the very embodiment of normality, we can all busy ourselves with moving ourselves towards that. So it makes that something that it makes those ideals that are also averages much more enforced, because everyone can do their best, to achieve them. But it also associates the process of aspiring to normality and working on oneself to change your bodily measurements so they fit those of an average. It makes something that you can do as a process of self-improvement as well. And I think the history of self-improvement is actually the history of eugenics, especially in Western cultures, like Anglophone cultures. Those two things are really embedded together. But because it's not that's the eugenics in the sense of make everything better all of the time, I think that dynamic really deserves a lot of critique as well. It is a dynamic that can make people miserable in just the way that, and have similar kinds of negative effects as the eugenics that we know is bad does. But I think that, again, that form of eugenics is much less visible because it seems problematic. But it's that the dynamic of eugenics that's in the idea of normalcy is the dynamic of improving things and making them better and engineering the normal distribution so that it's always improving. We want those results to get better all the time. So we want distribution to move along and to change. That engineering mindset that comes along with attends ideas of normality, I think embeds a kind of improving dynamic that directly comes from the history of eugenics, but is often not recognized as part of the history of eugenics.
Now, thinking about normalcy inevitably turns me towards one of your other books, and someone who clearly did not wish to see himself as such. Of course, I'm referring to Jean Genet, and you wrote a very important paragraph about him. For those who don't know of him, maybe you could give us a tour d'horizon of Genet as he appears in.
Oh, yes, a subject to my heart. Yes, thank you. So Jean Genet, for people who have not had the pleasure of discovering his work, was a queer French writer, mostly based in Paris, working actively in the 1930s and in the 1940s. He was France's first openly queer author, in that he put his own name on the covers of his book. And he did that at a time, of course, in the late 1930s and the 1940s, in which Paris was under occupation by the Nazis, who were, amongst other people that they were deporting, were people who were known to be homosexual as well. So it was an actual dangerous time to be doing what he did politically anyway. One of the reasons he did it is that he spent most of his life, he was a foundling child. So he had been left in orphanages and grew up in reform schools, spent most of his early adult life in jails in France, and so was under real threat of being exported during that period. And the writing that he did during that time was, he wrote in the most amazingly literary, quite florid French writing, very much in the style of Proust or André Gide. He knew his heritage of queer French writers, and he wrote the most stunning novels, mostly, you know, in jails with no education whatsoever, and was so impressed the leading lights of literature in his period, like Jean-Paul Sartre in the 1950s. Jean Cocteau did illustrations for one of his early novels. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote an enormous book on him in the 1950s. Derrida wrote one in the 1980s. I think that was in. So he was really beloved of French writers and intellectuals. And at the same time, his work is really just gobsmackingly beautiful to read. But at the same time, the whole way through his books, he says that he's doing it to, as a way, he has an article, for instance, called How I Scammed My Editor. And he talks about the fact that he's using this beautiful literary French as a tool against the bourgeoisie, who he hates, who he has so much resentment for, because he spent his life in jails and in reform schools and feeling like an outsider of the French. When the Nazis took over France, he's like, good, screw the French. Like, he's not on the side of the bourgeois French. And he knows that bourgeois gay men are his best target. In terms of, he talks about rolling them, you know, in his novels, but he also talks about the fact that he's using literature and this beautiful language as the master's tool, and he's using it against his readers, who he knows are bourgeois and love literature, as a way to wrong-foot them, as a way to disorient them, as a way to lead them astray. He uses writing as a very queer tool to undermine his readers, who he's openly quite antagonistic towards as well. So he's a beautiful example of a writer who is completely outside of the culture that he is also inside of, and uses the tools of the dominant class with great mastery, but as a way to attack that class and to undermine them.
Prof, I want to ask you also about another part of your work, more recent than Genet, which is about artificial intelligence, a field where vast energy is being expended, not only in research and commodification and governmentalization, but in opinion giving. Done some very interesting research that takes us back to almost the idea of the fairground of fakery and its contemporary iteration. So could you tell us a wee bit about that?
Thank you for asking about that. That was a fun recent piece to write. So the best way to answer your question is to look at the example that I use in that article, and it goes back to what we were talking about with the fairground stuff, exactly as you say at the start of our chat. And that is that I was looking at the rise of artificial intelligence and automated decision making around the Amazon, the company Amazon, around their job platform, which is called that famously provides the service that it provides. Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, describes it as artificial, that the Mechanical Turk platform provides a piecemeal employment force of human labor who will repair online systems and platforms that maybe aren't working properly or that need a human input. So maybe it's an algorithm that's malfunctioning. Maybe you need some data for something else. If you need a small piece of piecemeal, what Bezos calls human intelligence tasks, or hits they call them, you can hire a human to do that. And sometimes they pay unbelievably low. Sometimes the job is like 1 cent, 2 cents, and the Mechanical Turks have to make their way up a hierarchy so They can get paid decent amounts. The decent amounts are things like academics, I have to say, use a Mechanical Turk platform to do surveys and this kind of thing. That counts as a good job on the Mechanical Turk platform because academics actually pay a minimum wage to do that kind of work. Most of the work on that platform is not being paid anything close to a minimum wage because it's completely outside the employment laws at the moment. What interested me about, amongst the many things that are interesting about the Mechanical Turk platform, its role in the platformization of work. It's one of the first, it's before Uber and all of those. It sets the architecture for a lot of these, the gig economy to come. What's really interesting about this for someone who has an historical interest is that the term Mechanical Turk comes from what in effect was a robot / puppet from the 18th century. And it's the first technology that claimed to be an artificially intelligent technology. So it's a robot, it's a mechanical puppet, I would say accurately, that seemed to be able to play chess against people who would come in the audience to these sort of theatrical spectacles and watch it in that. It's a ticketed, event. It played the Mechanical Turk, plays against Benjamin Franklin and all kinds of, Napoleon, all kinds of famous people of the day. It tended to win as well. And what the person who invented the Mechanical Turk said was that the machine was making the decisions independently, that it was actually deciding the moves of the chess pieces around the chessboard. It's amazing enough that a machine in the 18th century could physically move chess pieces around a board, but let alone actually be deciding the moves and playing chess. So it was said to be the first artificially intelligent machine of the time. But of course, everyone in the 18th century knew that this was a complete hoax. There was no way that this was working. And so what it actually was a very famous example of a technological fake of the 18th century. And the reason it was fake was no one could work out how the game was played. So everyone would go along to how is the hoax done, and no one could work it out. So it wasn't famous as something that actually fooled people. It was a self-announced hoax, even in the 18th century. So I think this is a really rich model for understanding some of the things that are said about artificial intelligence, that some of the outlandish claims that are made, I think, are not just claims to fool a general public or to fool financial backers into believing some of the very hyped up claims that are made about artificial intelligence. Part of it is that old Barnum-esque thing of making claims that people will go, wait a minute, can that happen? And it becomes a site of debate where people, as we see people doing, as we are now, where we're pitching our wits against these machines that we don't understand because we don't know how the trick's done, because we do not understand the technology. It's a bit ahead of us. But I think that it becomes a magnet for these kinds of debates about where the limits and affordances of the technologies really are, rather than a sign of our gullibility.
Prof, I have one last question for you, and then I'd invite you to take over in a sense and add anything to what we've discussed. That might take the form of something entirely new, or it might involve revisiting a topic that we've mentioned. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a conclusion? So last question is...
It does.
Okay. Last question is critical medical humanities. This is part of what you're involved with. What is it?
Yes, so thank you for asking about that. It was one of the things that I got involved with during the pandemic, when we were all made aware in a very visceral way of what it meant to experience a global medical crisis that was clearly also a cultural crisis. as well. And so you can tell from our conversation, with the book on normality, that I've already been doing work in both the history of medicine, but also contemporary applications of medical research as well. But I got involved and set up a national network for people in the Australasian region who work in the health and medical humanities during the pandemic, because I couldn't do the research I'd been funded to do during the time. And it seemed like one of those moments where it's like, I think I'm being called to do something of practical application with the research that I do. Those of us who work in this area spend a lot of time talking about the history of pandemics on national radio in the start of 2020. So that was where that network came out of. It came out of wanting to bring together the people who already in Australia, a lot of countries have networks in this area now, but in Australia, people who are working in medical faculties at universities, people who are working for community organisations, people who are doing humanities work like me, who realise that the only way to deal with the kind of complex problems in the medical space, because as we know, like these days, something that is a medical crisis like the pandemic is also a crisis that comes out of climate change, that comes out of changing labour situations and all kinds of complex political and cultural formations. And so to have a place, and none of us, of course, are all going to be over the top of those kinds of things. I don't understand epidemiology, for instance, and will never understand the medical side of that. But to have these big networks of people who are motivated to work together and who recognise that, in fact, to have a period, a lot of us who work in the humanities have said for a long time, and not without our medical colleagues caring and listening and being interested in it, that there's no point us just talking to each other about it, that we need to be having these conversations. Those of us who look at the history of women or gay folk or disabled folk or other people who are culturally marginalised, Indigenous people, those histories in relation to medicine and health are some really complex history. And so those of us who have been working in those areas, thinking of diversity and access, in those spaces, have been working on this for a while with more and more enthusiasm, from our colleagues in the medical section. But the emergence of a field of health and medical humanities is recognition from both sides that both groups want to work on that. So now you see a lot more industry-related work in this area, and it's a big nodal point where people who do the kind of historical and aesthetic work that someone like me does can have a conversation and a much more applied impact in that area with people working in industry and people working in medicine and so on, because you don't have to make the case anymore that health and medicine are cultural concepts.
Wow, thanks for explaining that. Terrific. So, Prof, are there things you'd like to add to what we've said? As I indicated earlier, could be something old, new, blue, or borrowed.
Yeah, I would like to change the conversation completely, if that's allowed, Toby. One of the other things that I did over just quite recently finished was I was the president of Australia's Cultural Studies Association, Australasia's, I should say, over, a 4-year period from, 2019 up until the end of 2022. Rebecca Olive, who you have spoken to as well, is the current president of the CSAA. And so I'm also someone who thinks about, cultural studies as well as archives. And your podcast, Toby, brings two of those things together. I started off our conversation talking about the fact that I'm often looking at, informal archives or archives that we might not think of as archives, more sort of vernacular, popular archives like fairground rides, and things that happen at Coney Island and that kind of stuff. But when I was talking to you about doing this talk, and you said, oh, well, it'll follow the sort of line of the 650 odd other ones that I've done. done. I thought that is some 19th century ambition in archiving that you have going on with your podcast, because it is such a huge archive of work, some of which is in Spanish, which I noticed and appreciated as well, how much Spanish content there was too. So I wondered what you thought about your own archival process and your own project that I have now been absorbed into as a member of the people who have contributed in this. What your reflections are, on that process, and what you've, what you kind of reflections you've taken from doing that.
Yes, thanks for the query. I started doing this series in about 2010, when podcasts were pretty new. And I was saddened by the fact that in the United States, there were highly produced examples of radio, specifically through National Public Radio, NPR, but about very trivial matters. Often I was one of their go-to guys on the then Queen's corgis. For example, if there was a corgi issue, I was your man. Get on the blower, Paul Miller. And that a lot of these highly produced programs were really episodes of just 2 or 3 minutes. And I wanted a longer form of talk. So that urged me to get people involved. And I thought also that a nice model was Desert Island Discs, long-standing program from the BBC. But I soon discovered that the BBC's capacity to deal with intellectual property in the form of the playing of music owned by others was slightly more developed than mine. So I had to drop that idea after a few episodes and just recorded with people that I thought were interesting and that deserved, I thought, to have time devoted to their concerns. Yeah. And I called it cultural studies, but as one word and all lowercase, in order to endeavor to decenter any sense of my being an authority, but also an attempt to ensure that people who'd never heard of cultural studies wouldn't necessarily think that this had nothing to do with them. So it was a means of getting artists and attorneys and so on to participate. And after about 5 years, I stopped doing it because I had a series of professional and personal turmoils that made it something that was just too hard to do. And because it costs a fair bit, it's $2,000 a year to make it free for everybody, I also needed to try to stabilize my income, which had gone down dramatically. And then I got sick. I had major surgery a year ago, and emerged from that discovering that not only had the technology for making podcasts and distributing them changed quite radically, which I thought would intimidate me, but it actually changed in a way that made things much easier. Plus, there was the possibility of doing things remotely rather than in person, which I'd always done before. So really, wherever I lived in the world, that was where I'd done them. Now I didn't have to do that. So it was a means of reaching out to people, because after this surgery, I found for some months, I was lucky because I'd finished my last book 3 or 4 days before the operation. I found in the months afterwards that I could do other things I had to do, casual teaching, and reading and listening and talking, but I couldn't write. I mean, I could physically write, but not emotionally or intellectually. So I realized that the revised, renewed podcast would be a means of reaching out to people, meeting new people, seeing old people from the past, and doing something vaguely constructive with my time.
Yeah.
So that's how it's functioned from an autobiographical perspective. What value it holds for others, I don't know. And there have been times when I think it's quite popular, and others when it's not had a huge audience. So we'll see. We just did the first one in Italian, and that was fun, and suddenly a burst of Italian listeners.
Yeah. I love it, Toby. It's such a classic example. Foucault talks about the contingency of the archive and the difference between the sort of official sites of archiving and knowledge production and the sort of subaltern or unofficial ones. And I think we talk about these things as like archives as other things that we go to, but this is an archive that I talk is a part of, as an active part of. And I think it's a really beautiful elucidation of that kind of the contingency of those archives in action. And as someone who usually talks about archives rather than contributing to them, I appreciated that experience of experiencing that contingency in action.
Well, thank you for doing it, Prof. And it certainly is contingent. I don't think the French government's going to buy it. So, my current salary is €1,000 a month after tax, and I definitely need to keep paying $2,000 a year to keep this going, keep it free to everybody. So it may disappear. Download now if of interest.
The ephemera of the digital archive needs to
Indeed.
be preserved.
Indeed, Prof. Well, listen, thank you very, very much. It's been wonderful to get a chance to talk to you, and I'm sorry we didn't have more time to talk about a lot of these things, but it was terrific, and I hope you'll come back to the pod. Maybe you'll invite some collaborators to make a roundtable for us.
I love that. And it's a fantastic resource to use for those of us who teach as well, Toby, because they're informal chats as well.
Yes, it's very informal. So thanks a lot, Prof. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed our talk.
Bye-bye.
Bye.